Physical distancing, working from home, even just the disruption of our daily routines, it all takes a toll, even on those with the most robust coping skills. With us on adjusting to this new normal via Skype from Toronto, there's Dr. Suze Berkhout, clinician-investigator at the University Health Network and an assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Suze, it's good to meet you. How are you managing?
Hi, thanks so much. Doing okay right now. Thanks so much. How are
Well,
you?
I'm doing fine, but I guess I should broaden the question and say, based on your professional experience, how do you think people are coping during this new normal that we're in the midst of now?
It's an extremely stressful time for everyone. I think that from my experience as a clinician, I work in inpatient psychiatry, so I do more acute care. I sometimes work in the emergency departments. We do continue to have concerns about our patients who have more serious forms of mental illness and who are struggling right now. A lot of the different kinds of social and economic restrictions have limited the kinds of community supports that people really often rely on. I think from my colleagues who work in areas like perinatal mental health, they're very concerned about how the folks that they work with are doing. Social isolation is a real challenge for new mothers who might be struggling with depression and anxiety. So it's another group of individuals. I think the folks who work very much closely with people who are precariously housed, we're seeing a lot of challenges in those areas, and of course, I think across the board, people are really having to try to figure out how to cope with this. I think one of the big challenges has been the extent of the uncertainty around how long things like physical and social distancing are going to last for, how long different kinds of layoffs are might be happening, school closures, that kind of thing. All of the things that give our day-to-day lives structure have really been turned on their heads, and that's a huge challenge for everyone.
Well, I guess it's no surprise, obviously, that people experiencing mental health issues would be on the list of people that you just mentioned. But if I hear you right, the list goes well beyond just that group of people. And I wonder whether you think measures taken by our governments, you know that the Prime Minister has been out before the microphones every day, announcing a variety of financial backstopping programs, the Premier of Ontario doing likewise. Do those go a great distance to mitigating some of the anxiety people would be feeling today?
I'm certainly happy to hear about all the different measures. I think some of the other things that we're hearing about here in Toronto as well have been how the city is going to be collaborating to try to be able to work through challenges related to shelter and housing for people who are precariously housed or unhoused. All of those things, I think, are really important steps for helping people with all of these uncertainties. So, we know that any kind of mental health issue is going to be exacerbated by stress, by the kinds of things that make it hard for people to do things like, have sleep hygiene, have, healthy, nutritious meals, all of those kinds of things. So the sort of financial pressures and uncertainties are certainly having those responded to in a very timely way. I think is going to help lower the uncertainties and the questions for people. But overall, what we're trying to help folks with, I think, is how do you adapt and how do you remain flexible and how do you cope with all of the uncertainties that are going on right now, because it's an extremely stressful time for everyone.
I gather you have a kind of a specific equation or definition about the nature of anxiety. You want to share that with us?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's one way that I certainly think about anxiety, and I think it's helpful in trying to understand what's going on, and in particular, it helps us understand why now is such a stressful and anxiety-producing time for people. So anxiety is our body's warning system. It's a collection of physical sensations, thoughts, feelings, all designed to inform when there's a possible threat. And when people are struggling with anxiety, what they're struggling with is this relationship between what we estimate the risk of a perceived threat to be and our sense of how well we can cope with it. So that's a really dynamic relationship. And you can kind of imagine it like a teeter totter. there's on the one end, you've got your perception of the threat, and on the other end, your sense of how well you can cope with it. And so in the current pandemic situation, we have the information coming in on a regular basis about the perceived threat is regularly being updated, and there's constantly this barrage of new information and a changing situation and changing scenario in terms of how much and what we have to attend to that could be a risk to us. And then there's your sense of how well you can cope with that. And so when you pile in the uncertainties on both ends of that equation, then it produces more anxiety. And so we can understand why, even for people who might not necessarily struggle with things like anxiety, this kind of situation in particular is really difficult.
Now, having said all that, let me look at the flip side of this coin, which is there are a lot of people right now who are not fighting traffic or fighting for a spot on a bus or a streetcar or a subway, who are not spending 30 to 90 or 120 minutes commuting every day now, but who are still working. Now, can we conclude that their lives may be a little less anxious as a result of not having to do that anymore?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we want to sort of take what you're pointing to are all of the different ways in which their day-to-day lives might have these other kinds of uncertainties, and how some of those could be settled down. But then you sort of think about folks who are trying to now work from home. They're not commuting, but they might have small children in the mix. So now they're trying to kind of carry on their work in this very new environment. But they've also got parenting, attempting to do some kind of homeschooling, that kind of thing, throw all of that on, and trying to follow all of the really important public health recommendations. And it's a really, really stressful environment. And so I think for people to notice that they're more worried or more stressed would be very, very normal. And I think that's one of the things that we try to help people with is really being able to tune in to what it feels like for you when you're struggling with stress or having difficulties coping, because it feels very different for different people. You might notice that your frustration is a little bit higher, more irritable with people. You don't always get this sort of message from your mind or from within your body saying, hey, you're worried. You might actually just feel this kind of muscle tension. You might feel you might notice your heart rate is faster. You might have a knot in your stomach that you can't quite put your finger on. All of those kinds of physical sensations, but you can also have different kinds of emotions that don't necessarily sort of flag for you worry, and oftentimes frustration, irritability, that kind of thing. And so being able to pay attention to that and tune into that is one of the ways that you can start to figure out how do you then help yourself kind of lower the level of worry and calm that intensity.
Hmm. Sue, somebody told me this story the other day, and I think they meant it facetiously, but I don't know. So I'll put it to you, and you tell me. 50 years ago in New York City, there was a famous blackout, and 9 months after the blackout ended, there were a whole lot of kids born in New York City. And the point they made to me was they could imagine that as soon as this COVID-19 lockdown situation ended, there were going to be a whole lot of people filing for divorce and putting their kids up for adoption. Do you think there's something to that?
So it's, I have seen a very funny internet meme that actually sort of, speaks to that question of a baby boom. And it says the baby boom that's coming will all be firstborn children, because the people who are struggling with their kids at home and trying to do their work or just get by on a day-to-day basis with all of this uncertainty are probably have their hands full. But I think what it asks of us really, and what you're pointing to, is how do we manage to increase our sense of coping without sort of clinging to things too rigidly. So we all have to sort of be able to try to be flexible, to be adaptable, to be responsive to when things like public health recommendations change. And how can we do that in a way that's going to preserve our relationships? Because I think that's one of the things that we really think about on the mental health end of things as a clinician or as a psychiatrist, is that sometimes anxiety can actually be helpful to people. It's a warning system about a threat. What it ends up often doing is that if you're someone who's going through things like worst case scenarios, what it means is that you're actually sort of getting ready for different kinds of contingencies. It can be very functional to have a certain level of worry, so that you're thinking about the future, you're preparing for different kinds of things. The challenge is when that worry or when that anxiety gets to the point that it's impairing your roles, your obligations, your relationships. And that's when we really start to think of it as a challenge where people need to be able to intervene. So, similarly, if your level of worry is meaning that you can't find ways to be able to problem solve, where if things start to become too overwhelming and then you can't cope with the issues that you have in front of you, whether that's parenting or your work or how you're going to be able to help, say, a family member who might be relying on you, but you're trying to physically distance yourself from to help keep them safe. That's when you really want to be able to dive into using different strategies to help calm the distress, lower the intensity, and get the sort of problem solving part of your brain really back online again.
Well, let me follow up on that one directly. Would you happen to know anybody who might be having a fifth birthday today, for example?
Gosh, yes, my this is one of those this is exactly one of those really terrible, difficult situations. My son Peter is having his fifth birthday today, and I'm here in Toronto. Peter is with my parents and with my partner in Niagara. And we had decided that we would separate for at least for now because I've been working on the inpatient service in the hospital, and we're trying to do our best to keep everyone safe and keep everyone well. And my parents are doing an incredible job helping my partner so that he can also carry out with his work. And so, we're all doing the best that we can. And so, it's in some ways it's heartbreaking to not be there for his fifth birthday. And in other ways, we've all tried to find how we are going to connect across the distance. So I've already FaceTimed in at least twice today, partly to see a few presents get opened, see what's happening for lunch. He's had a few different things already today. They set up some banners and balloons, and I'll be calling in tonight. We're gonna have a party tonight over FaceTime, and so I think that's one of the things about struggling with the distress is that you have to sort of lower the intensity to be able to come up with, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make this a new normal? And then also, the whole of our family is really reframing everything in this case, for his birthday, as we're all doing our part to keep each other safe, to keep each other well and healthy, and so that mom and in their case, their mom can continue to help out in the hospital where needed.
Gotcha. Suze, I'm going to, you were kind enough to give us ahead of time a list of three things that people ought to do if they feel anxious. And I'm going to read those right now, and then we'll have about 30 seconds for you to sort of sum it up and put a bow on it once I'm done reading this list. Number one, understand that anxiety is normal. Very important. Number two, reframe the struggle. Go from I can't cope to I'm going to do my best to cope. And number three, which always helpful regardless, breathe deeply in a moment of crisis. Reconnect to your physical being. And you didn't give us this one, but I would probably add number four to the list. Watch as little American cable television as possible right now, because that'll just make you nuts as well. Anyways, maybe you could sum all that up for us and put a bow on it, if you wouldn't mind.
I'd love to. Yeah. And so the first thing is to remember that this is an unprecedented situation, and anxiety in this case is very much normal. Especially when we think about that equation and that balance between the uncertainty surrounding the perceived threat and then our sense of how well we can cope with it being all sort of turned on its head. And so then you want to really try to focus on how well can you cope, and how are you going to get into that coping frame of mind. So the first thing is recognize the worry in that case, calm the intensity. That's where the breathing comes in. Other kinds of practices that can be helpful are things like progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness, grounding techniques, all of those good things that can help lower and calm the level of the intensity. And then you can move into the reframing things in terms of I am doing my part to keep my vulnerable community members well. This is part of a larger collective effort in terms of the things that are hard about social distancing. Also, when you've got a challenge, let's break it down into smaller pieces and how are we going to work with it, and then finding those ways to connect so that what you're doing is physically distancing yourself, but you're not socially isolating yourself.
Great advice from Dr. Suze Berkhout from UHN and U of T. Thanks for coming on TVO tonight, Dr. Berkhout. Appreciate it very much.
It was a pleasure. Take care.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.